Sumerian tablets are probably one of the oldest form of written record that we have. They've been translated, and they tell exciting stories about how God...
For decades, this broken clay Sumerian tablet sat on a shelf because no one could fully read what was written on it.
What we're looking at here is a Sumerian tablet that actually shows the Tree of Life, flanked by divine beings. You can see here the Anunnaki on each side.
The marks were too damaged, too faint, and too confusing for any human to decode.
These types of tablets are usually quite easy to identify just from looking at them, really. So you start out and perhaps you get the size and the shape, and you have a little look at the writing. You look for key things like maybe there are numbers.
Then a quantum-level AI system ran through every scratch and wedge and pulled the full message out. And once the translation appeared, the room went quiet. The warning on that tablet could not be ignored. How a broken clay tablet from Nippur turned into a time bomb on a museum shelf. A small brown tablet sits in a glass case in Philadelphia, and most people walk past it without even slowing down. It looks like a rough rectangle of baked mud, edges broken, surface crowded with tiny wedge marks in neat rows. The label says it comes from the ancient city of Nippur in southern Iraq and belongs to the Babylonian section of the Penn Museum. What survives is only the lower part of a much larger piece written on both sides. The preserved section carries 6 slim columns of text, 3 on each face. Each column holds roughly between 10 and 15 lines, and scholars estimate that the complete tablet once held around 260 lines of writing. The clay is hard, the surface worn in patches, with cracks cutting through some of the most crowded lines. It is small enough to rest in one hand, about 5 inches long, about 4 inches wide, and less than 1 inch thick. But every side is packed with wedges. This unimpressive lump carries one of the longest continuous Sumerian literary texts that has ever been found. For many decades, though, this tablet lay in storage trays in study rooms as just one more object from one more dig, while the warning that it holds sat quietly locked inside the wedges. To understand how that happened, everything has to roll back to Nippur itself. Nippur was never the political capital of Mesopotamia, but for the Sumerians, it was the holy city, home of the great temple complex called the Ekor, dedicated to the chief god, Enlil. In the late 19th century, the University of Pennsylvania sent what became the first American archaeological expedition to Mesopotamia. Teams of local workers and foreign archaeologists cut into huge mounds of sun-baked brick, trench by trench, under the heat of the southern Iraqi plains. Over roughly 12 years of off-and-on digging, they mapped the religious center with its temple in Ziggurat, explored the business quarter, and opened up an area that became famous as the Scribal Quarter. That Scribal Quarter changed the way scholars see Nippur. In house after house, the teams uncovered stacks and scatterings of clay tablets. Some were simple business notes or contracts. Others held hymns, myths, royal praise poems, and complex school exercises. Reports from the excavations described thousands of cuneiform tablets pulled from those rooms still lying where ancient students and professional scribes had left them. Archaeologists later compared that area to a national library buried under its own ruins. Among the many crates of tablets that left Nippur for Philadelphia was one broken piece that would later be cataloged in the museum and recognized as the main witness to what is now called Eridu Genesis. At the time it was packed and shipped, it was just another line on a shipping inventory. What the expedition had actually sent home was a clay tablet from the Old Babylonian period, written sometime around the 17th century before Christ. The language of the text is Sumerian, even though Sumerian had already stopped being a spoken everyday tongue by then. Scribes in that age treated Sumerian as a learned, classical language, and they copied older religious and literary works as part of their advanced training. Later studies of schoolhouses at Nippur show that large literary tablets like this were usually written by higher-level students or specialists, not beginners learning their first signs. That already hints that the content of this particular tablet was considered serious and important in its own time. The way the text is written on the clay adds to the challenge. Cuneiform script is made of small wedge-shaped impressions pressed into damp clay with the cut tip of a reed stylus. Each sign is a pattern of wedges arranged at different angles. A single sign can stand for a whole word, for part of a word, or for an idea marker that guides how the reader should take other signs around it. Even in its mature form, the script uses hundreds of different signs, many with several possible values.
Reading any long Sumerian text is slow work, and reading a damaged one forces you to make assumptions all the way through. The physical state of this tablet makes those choices even harder. Big chunks are missing from the upper part and from one whole side. Cracks run down through columns of text, cutting signs in half. In some rows, the wedges are so shallow that they almost fade into the clay. This means the story cannot be reconstructed from this single object alone. Only by pairing it with overlapping fragments from other sites, and by using modern imaging and now artificial intelligence to bring out faint marks, can scholars even try to reconstruct the full sequence of lines. From the moment it arrived in Philadelphia, anyone who wanted to understand it had to treat it like a puzzle with missing pieces. Once the crate reached the museum, staff did exactly what they did with every other tablet. Conservators cleaned the surface, stabilized cracks, and gave the piece a catalog number in the Babylonian section. Specialists made hand copies of the wedges on graph paper, stroke by stroke, and took black and white photographs. For some tablets, they also made plaster squeezes, pressing soft material against the surface to capture the shape of the signs in reverse. All of this documentation went into files and card catalogs that almost no member of the public ever saw. For the outside world, the tablet was just one more line in a printed list of objects, with a place name, a period label, and a few short words of description. It took a determined young Assyriologist to push this object out of that quiet corner and into the center of a much bigger discussion. In the summer of 1912, the German scholar Arno Pobel spent several months at the Penn Museum copying tablets from the Nipper collection for a planned volume of historical texts. He was not looking for myths in particular. He was hunting for anything that might shed light on early Mesopotamian history and language. While working through the Nipper tablets, he came across this damaged piece and realized that its long, carefully structured lines were not simple records. Pobel laboriously copied the tablet sign by sign into Latin letters, a process called transliteration. He then worked out a rough translation and published the results. Other scholars soon saw that the story on this tablet did not stand alone. Separate fragments from the city of and from the Royal Library of Nineveh preserved overlapping sections of the same Sumerian text. In the 1980s, Thoriel Jacobson pulled the material together and suggested calling the whole composition Eridu Genesis, a name that has stuck ever since. From that point on, the tablet in Philadelphia was no longer just another Nipper object. It became the primary witness to a very old Sumerian story that stretches from the making of humans and the founding of early cities, all the way to a near-total crisis for the world those humans built. Only a fraction of the original text survives on this one tablet, but its wording and layout anchor the whole reconstruction. The fragments from and Nineveh fill some of the gaps, and newer finds from Nipper, published in the 21st century, have added a few more lines, particularly about the choice of the very first king. The big obstacles to reading this text have always been the script, the language, and the damage. Over the past few decades, new tools have begun to break down those obstacles. High-resolution digital photography under raking light can make very shallow wedges stand out as sharp shadows. Three-dimensional scanning projects now capture the full surface of cuneiform tablets, allowing researchers to rotate and examine the signs from any angle without ever touching the original. In some labs, multispectral imaging reveals faint traces of strokes that normal light cannot catch at all. Computer vision and artificial intelligence projects are learning to spot individual wedge strokes in tablet photos and help figure out damaged or tightly packed signs.
Start to sound less
Work
like
that
simple
once took
stories
weeks
and more
of
like
slow
different
manual
faces of the
tracing
same
now
deep
moves
fear.
much faster.
Other warnings on clay.
Now that we can
A city
read more of these marks, the question that follows is this: what story do they tell? And what warning did the ancient scribe think was important enough to press into wet clay for future readers?
The warning pressed into this clay tablet. When the text on that clay tablet finally started to make sense, it did not happen all at once. Language experts first spread out copies of different fragments on their desks, one from Nippur, one from and a later piece from the Royal Library at Nineveh. That last fragment gives the Sumerian lines side by side with an Akkadian translation, a related Semitic language from the same region. They treated these pieces like parts of one long song. Wherever the wording matched, they locked the lines together, and slowly a single story began to appear. The opening of the story is gone on the main tablet, but the missing lines can be sketched from what is left on the fragment and from notes in later texts. The lost beginning seems to have talked about how humans and animals first came into being and how humans lived before there were real towns. In that stage, people wandered, moved with their herds, and did not yet have steady homes, city walls, or shrines. Life was restless, unsafe, and loosely organized, and the gods had to live with noisy, unstable human beings who were not yet doing proper service in fixed holy places. The first clear speech we have belongs to a goddess called Nintur, also known in other sources as a birth goddess who looks after humans. She complains that people drift from place to place and that there is no lasting order. She wants humans to settle down, build cities, and raise temples where daily offerings can be made. Her speech is not just about comfort, it is about creating a world where the gods receive regular care and the people have leaders who answer for them. After this plan is set, the story moves into a list of the very first cities. It names Eridu as the first city and says it was placed under the care of the god Enki. Then it names Bodtira, Larak, Sipar, and Shuruppak, each with its own ruler and patron god. These are not random towns thrown together. In the Sumerian way of thinking, this list is a sacred map. It shows where true kingship and proper worship first took root on Earth, and it links each city to a specific divine guardian in the sky. The text then breaks again for several dozen lines, but other sources fill in some of the gap. It seems that kingship moves from city to city, rulers rise and fall, and human life becomes busier, louder, and more crowded. It is at this point, after cities and kings are in place, that the story shifts into its darkest turn. A group of high gods holds council. The main tablet does not spell out every reason, but later flood stories from the same region talk about humans being too noisy, too many, and too hard to manage. The flavor is the same here. The decision is simple and brutal. They will send a flood to wipe out almost everyone. A decision was reached in the divine council. A great flood would cleanse the earth, erasing the mistakes of humanity. This decision happens far above the human world. No one on Earth is invited into the meeting. No king hears the debate. No city receives a warning from an official messenger. In the story, regular people keep living their lives in the low plain close to the rivers with no idea that the leaders of the divine world have already signed their death order. Only one god refuses to accept this. Enki, linked with fresh underground water and with clever plans, decides to bend the rules without openly breaking them. The human who matters most at this point is a man named Zuyusra. The text calls him king and priest of Shuruppak, which is one of the cities already listed earlier. That double role is important. As king, he has the power to act. As priest, he is supposed to listen closely to the gods. In some lines, he is also called humble and obedient, which makes him the kind of person a god might trust with a secret that no one else is allowed to hear. Enki never walks up to Zuyusra and speaks face to face. Instead, he turns to a wall near where Zuyusra is sitting or lying down and speaks to the wall as if it could hear. In other words, he talks loudly enough in the right place that a human on the other side can pick up every line, while the god can still say he never told the man directly. This odd detail also shows up later in the Akkadian stories. In the flood tale in Atrahasis and in the flood speech in the 11th tablet of Gilgamesh, the god Ea, who is the Akkadian form of Enki, whispers his warning through the reeds of a house wall. The warning itself is simple and sharp. A great flood is coming that will sweep over the land and erase almost all human life. The decision is final. Zuyusra cannot stop it. His only choice is between silence and action. Enki tells him to build a huge boat, big enough to hold himself, his family, and living creatures whose survival will matter for whatever comes next. The tablet does not keep the full technical plan. The lines that might have given the exact shape or size are gone. But it is very clear that the boat is not a small fishing craft. It is a large, special vessel built for one purpose only, to ride out what no normal house or town can survive. The story does not waste time on side scenes. Once the warning is given and the boat is built and loaded, the flood comes. Here, the Nippur tablet becomes vivid again. It speaks of a terrible storm that rages for 7 days and 7 nights. All the evil winds and stormy winds are said to gather into one force. The flood sweeps over the cities, and the big boat is tossed about on the great waters. Then the storm breaks. The text says that the sun god Utu appears spreading light over the sky and the ground. At that moment, Ziusudra opens a window in the boat. For the first time in many days, fresh light and air pour in. As the rains began, Ziusudra's ark sheltered his family and animals. When the waters receded, Ziusudra filled with gratitude. He bows low before the sun and the other gods and prepares a huge offering. When the boat comes to rest and it is safe to step down, he slaughters oxmen and sheep and burns them as a sacrifice. In the closing part of the story, the focus shifts to a small group of high gods again. Ziusudra appears in front of An, the sky god, and Enlil, who is presented as a powerful lord. The text says they give him breath eternal for preserving both the animals and the seed of mankind. In a few later lines from a related text, the reward is described with a bit more color. Ziusudra is said to be settled in the distant land of Dilmun, the bright place where the sun rises. That means the story does not end with him stepping back into normal life. It ends with him being moved to a far, pure land and given a kind of lasting life that ordinary people do not get. Other Sumerian tablets that talk about cities and ruins and kings under a curse fit into this pattern in their own way. They do not always bring water. Sometimes the disaster comes as war, famine, or foreign invasion. But after seeing how this tablet treats the whole human world as something that can be switched off
Other
by a
tales
single
start to
hidden
sound
decision,
less like simple
those other
stories and
tales
more
start
like
to sound
different
less
faces
like
of the
simple
same deep
stories
fear.
and more like
Other
different
warnings
faces
on
of the
clay.
same
A
deep
city.
fear. Other warnings on clay, a city in ruins, and a king under a curse. Sumerian writers left long poems about cities smashed to the ground and a famous king whose pride helped destroy his own capital. Two of the strongest examples are the lament over the destruction of the city of and a story called The Curse of a God, which tries to explain why the city of fell so hard. The path to the lament over starts the same way as many Mesopotamian stories do, with stray tablets in different places. Early pieces turned up in the temple library at Neper and went into the collection of the University of Pennsylvania. George Barton published a first set of lines in the early 1900s and thought he was looking at a prayer for Later, more copies came out of the ground at itself and from museum shelves in cities like London, Istanbul, Jena, Oxford, Geneva, Berlin, and New Haven. Only when Samuel Noah Kramer and other experts put more than 20 fragments side by side did a long, steady text start to appear. In its full form, it runs to a little over 430 lines, grouped into 11 sections that repeat certain phrases and images like a song. One of the best preserved copies sits today in the Louvre in Paris under the number A06446. The museum notes that the tablet carries a lament in 11 songs about the ruin of written in Sumerian. The piece itself is not huge. It is a hand-sized tablet with rounded edges and tight columns of wedge signs on both sides. It looks like a tired brown brick, but every line is loaded with grief. What makes this lament so intense is the voice it uses. The speaker for most of the poem is Ningal, the goddess linked with and the wife of the moon god Nana. Nana was the son of Enlil, a major pantheon god, father of the sun god Utu, and the goddess of love and war, Ishtar. She talks as if she is standing inside her own city while it is being judged. She begs the highest gods, An and Enlil, not to let the disaster fall. She reminds them of the offerings, the songs, and the loyalty that is shown. The poem then makes it painfully clear that her pleas fail. The great storm still comes. When she speaks again, she is not pleading for mercy. She is walking through ruins and crying over what has already been lost. The pictures the poem uses are simple enough that anyone can feel them. Temples that once held statues of the gods are smashed and empty. Streets that were once packed with traders and carts are cold and silent. Houses stand open with no one inside. Fields that once gave grain are now dry and cracked, with no workers and no harvest. The people of are dead, scattered as captives or on the road as refugees. In the background sits a real event, the fall of the third dynasty of when Elamite forces and local rivals brought down the royal house and power shifted to other cities in the south. The lament treats that shift as the moral end of a whole world. This poem did not stay locked in one moment. Copies of the lament for show up on tablets from the early 2nd millennium before Christ, far from the time when actually fell. Scholars who study school tablets have shown that advanced students in scribal schools copied this text as a kind of final exam. You did not get this poem on your first day of training. You got it when you were trusted with long, hard material. That means young writers in many cities sat and scratched out the tears of a goddess over and over, long after the smoke over had cleared. Every copy turned the fall of one city into a warning lesson for other cities. If the link between your god, your king, and your people breaks, even a proud capital can become a ghost city. Modern writers have noticed how close this sounds to the way the Book of Lamentations talks about Jerusalem centuries later. Both sets of texts mourn a real city that has been destroyed. Both speak in the voice of Enlil, someone close to the city, walking through broken streets and asking why this happened. There is no direct copy line that we can prove, but many scholars now see the Sumerian city laments, including the lament for as the earliest clear examples of this way of thinking. The curse of a god shows what happens when a human ruler helps push his own city over the edge. Agad, also called Akkad, was the capital of the Akkadian Empire, and Naram Sin was one of its strongest kings. Naram Sin, whose name can also be pronounced Naram Suan, was already a great warrior by the time of his ascension to the throne. The story we call the Curse of a God was written centuries after his lifetime, probably under the later kings of Ur, and survives in many school copies from the early 2nd millennium before Christ. Gerald Cooper and other scholars use those small tablets to rebuild the full tale, line by line. The story starts with a god at its peak. The city is full of goods, trade routes are busy, the gods seem pleased, and people believe the future is safe. Then, something changes. The high god Enlil withdraws his favor. Signs and oracles fall silent. There are no clear messages from the divine world. Naram Sin waits, then grows more and more angry at this long silence. In the poem, his anger turns into a terrible choice. Instead of waiting, he marches on Nippur, the religious center of Sumer, and attacks the Ekher in Enlil's own temple. The text pictures him tearing down sacred walls and carrying off treasures that were never meant to leave that holy place. That one act becomes the turning point. Enlil and the other great gods answer, not with a storm, but with a curse spoken over the whole city of a god. They call down the Gudians, mountain people from the east, and turn them into a living weapon. Later copies of the poem describe the Gudians as people who do not talk like normal folk, who move like packs of animals, and who sweep across the fields like a hunting net. Under their raids, normal life breaks apart. Trade boats stop moving on the rivers, messengers no longer travel the roads, prisoners and bandits stand where guards and officials once stood. The curse reaches even into the food supply. One famous passage says that prices climb so high that a single lamb can buy only half a small measure of grain, or half a measure of oil, or half a weight of wool. Fields that once gave rich harvests now yield nothing. Canals turn to bitter water. Places that once held heart-soothing plants now grow only weeds with names like Reed of Tears. Houses where people once slept in safety become so bad that, in the poet's words, anyone who says, "I want to live in a god," finds no good place to live, and anyone who says, "I want to sleep there," finds no good place to lie down. The city that was once the center of an empire becomes a place people avoid. Readers in later centuries, especially under the kings of Ur, may have used this story as a way to talk about limits on royal power without naming their own rulers. Agade and Naram Sin became a safe way to deliver a real warning. If a king treats the holy center of the country like just another target, everyone pays the price. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.